guess housekeeping note before we get started. As you just heard, we're going to record this session. So if folks are interested in viewing it afterwards, you can let us know, or I think view it on Zoom. So thanks for joining. My name is Brian Sergi. I'm at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. I'm going to present some work today on solar and storage integration focused on the U.S. Southeast, with a specific focus on resource adequacy implications. And this is work done in collaboration with folks at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, as well as Fritz Carl at Third Rail. So this study is actually part of a larger project that is looking at understanding changes to electricity system economics, reliability, resource adequacy, and operations in the U.S. Southeast, all with the focus on, what are the implications with higher levels of solar and storage, and also looking at things like the impact of regional coordination. This project had three parts. The first was a kind of solar storage integration study. It's phase one. And for this, we kind of focused much more on what a system would operate, or how a system would operate if it had higher levels of storage and solar in the system, with a focus on production cost modeling and the implications for economics and reliability. That work has been published, and we can circulate links to that later if folks are interested. Phase two was more focused on forecasting and specifically asking the question of how better solar forecasting might change operational behavior, and specifically how you might utilize your storage differently to account for things like solar forecast uncertainty. And we're working on publishing that work, or in the process of getting that reviewed now. And then the third phase is on resource adequacy for energy limited systems, specifically thinking about higher levels of solar and storage impacting how systems achieve resource adequacy, and looking at things like regional coordination and demand side resources in terms of meeting those goals. So this presentation will be kind of entirely focused on this third study here. Okay, and so a bit of motivation on resource adequacy. This essentially means having enough power system resources to meet your demand at all times. Traditionally, making sure that your system was resource adequate required a set of methods that would essentially determine the contribution of your resources to meet your peak load periods, or your load during stress periods. Typically, this was in your peak net load, but systems often attribute or identify specific periods that they think are stressful, and then consider the ability of resources to basically meet load during those periods. That contribution is then often quantified as a capacity credit. So the ability of any resource to meet RA during that time period is its capacity credit. Now, systems, as they adopt higher levels of weather-dependent resources or energy-limited resources, are likely to require more advanced resource adequacy approaches than the kind of traditional take one period and look at a resource's capacity credit during that period. This might include features like hourly chronological grid operations and modeling, accounting for things like correlated outages, so the fact that different generator classes might all be out at the same time because of underlying factors. And then also considering a wider set of years of weather data to really understand the availability of these resources across a wide range of weather realizations. So given that, you could think of this traditional approach, which I'm sort of referring to as the capacity credit approach, where you would take a generation portfolio. This might be your current system, or one that you're trying to evaluate for the future. You might do an initial assessment of what your reserve margin needs to be to achieve a certain resource adequacy metric. So if you have a 1 in 10 LOLE target, you might need to figure out what the appropriate buffer to account for uncertainty and load and other resources is. So that buffer determines your planning reserve margin that you would kind of feed into your future system. And then you'd also, evaluate the ability of resources to meet that total requirement, which would be the, peak load plus your planning reserve margin. And ultimately, you kind of take those inputs and you put them into a capacity expansion model, and you figure out the least cost system that kind of achieves your resource adequacy targets. So that approach is one way to do it, but as mentioned before, this can miss some of the kind of new features that we might want to consider for resource adequacy. And so I'd like to discuss kind of a second approach here, which we're referring to as an iterative approach, which tries to bake in more detailed resource adequacy assessment. And in this kind of approach, you take your initial system and you can evaluate it using a more detailed resource adequacy tool. And once you do that, you might identify periods of stress, which maybe are things like the top net peak load hours, but might also be different periods that you didn't typically identify in the capacity credit approach. And then once you've identified those periods, you can feed them back into your capacity expansion model and re-optimize, rebuild the system after accounting for these periods that you know to be stressful for the system. And you could imagine kind of, circling around until you've kind of iterated and achieved something that's met your resource adequacy criteria. So for this study, we were interested in kind of testing this approach. So we wanted to understand how, doing this kind of integrated capacity expansion portfolio planning tool with a probabilistic resource adequacy model would really address challenges that exist for planning systems, particularly with higher amounts of solar. In the course of that, we were also interested in kind of better understanding some of the drivers of unserved energy, particularly with existing capacity credit or resource adequacy methods when you have systems with higher level of solar. And then finally, with this method, interested also in exploring a bit how it could be used to understand different types of interventions. You can think of things like load reduction or regional coordination. So this iterative method could be used to evaluate the effectiveness of those to meet resource adequacy targets cost effectively, and also how robust the tool is to throwing different conditions, different weather years or load growth scenarios and things like that. So we evaluate those in kind of a set of sensitivities, and I'll talk a bit more about those in detail. Okay, so for this integrated approach, we rely on two open source tools. The first is a capacity expansion modeling tool, specifically REEDS, which is a tool developed at NREL for long-term planning in the electric power system. The second is a resource adequacy assessment tool, and this is called PRAS. It's probabilistic, so it uses kind of simulations to evaluate chronological hourly operations and make sure, basically it can evaluate, a system and test for random outages and, weather availability to understand if you're resource adequate in any given period. So to kind of compare the integrated approach, we're going to essentially do an evaluation of both methods. So the first is the capacity credit method, or the traditional method. And this is actually an approach we've been using in REEDS for a long time. In this framework, what we have typically done is, we've taken results from a prior solve year for the existing capacity build, and REEDS basically optimizes for the next solve period. So it's a linear program, which is fed information about representative days at 4-hour time resolution. And it satisfies a bunch of operational constraints, and the resource adequacy component is essentially evaluated using a kind of separate side module that looks at hourly weather and load realizations to understand the capacity credit of resources during the net peak periods. We take a top slice of those net peak periods, and that determines the capacity credit for new investments, which is fed back into REEDS for the next year. So each solve year, you're getting information on capacity credit for new resource investments that will inform your future builds. So that's the capacity credit approach. Then the stress period approach, or the iterative approach we call the stress period approach, is now trying to bring in the resource adequacy assessment into the loop. So it's the same kind of setup for REEDS, where REEDS builds a system. It's got the representative periods that it's using to make sure the system can operate. But then what we do is we basically pass that system over to PRAS and now evaluate that system over full 7 years of hourly data using probabilistic simulation of outages we incorporate in there correlated outages with weather, and I'll talk about a bit about that more later. With those PRAS runs, we can then identify first whether the system meets its reliability target. For that, we're looking whether expected unserved energy of the system is below a certain planning threshold. If the target is above the actual realization in PRAS, then we're done. The system has met its reliability goal and it's resource adequate. But if it's not, we basically pick out a select few days with the highest expected unserved energy from PRAS, and we bake them back into the reads model. So now we add those periods to be directly represented in reads, and then we rerun reads now with those periods explicitly captured. And so then we rerun reads, we get a new build out, we go back and test that in PRAS, and we evaluate PRAS just as before. And this process can be iteratively repeated again until we meet our reliability target. So to compare these approaches, we can basically run them. We get a final build out over the solve period, and then we can, in both cases, use PRAS to essentially evaluate how well we did. So the capacity credit method you could think of as an approximation heuristic for understanding different resources' ability to meet resource adequacy. And then PRAS serves as the final test to essentially compare how the system built with the capacity credit method does against the stress periods method. A bit more information here. There's some other details. We could talk about this more in the paper, but we set a planning reserve margin of 12% for both the capacity credit method, which is used to determine that planning reserve on the net peak load requirement for total firm capacity needs. It's also used in the stress periods to kind of bump up and account for uncertainty that reads would not be able to capture relative to PRAS. We use 10 Monte Carlo samples for the PRAS analysis, but then up that for 50 for the final system, just to try to get a more robust testing of the actual final build out. And we set an expected unserved energy target in the stress periods approach of 10 parts per million of demand. So that's essentially saying that the unserved energy is a certain share of the total load across the entire window. Okay, a couple more modeling assumptions then. So we're running reads for the Eastern interconnection. We run it through 2050 with 3-year time steps. We're primarily interested in the Southeast, but we represent the entire interconnection so we can capture interactions with neighboring regions. But we do also run the Southeast balancing areas essentially as porous islands. So we allow energy trade, but we apply a hurdle rate of $10 a megawatt hour to kind of simulate some friction of trading in the Southeast across BAs or with the neighbors. And we don't allow firm capacity trade. So that's either trading to meet your RA requirements in the capacity credit approach or trading during the stress periods. So there's basically systems have to kind of plan their own way to resource adequacy, even though they can trade energy when they have surplus. Cost assumptions for our modeling are primarily derived from the annual technology baseline. So this includes, capital cost assumptions for solar, batteries, and other technologies. I mentioned this a little bit before, but when reads dispatch is performed using representative days. So we select a set of 36 days using 2012 weather profile for kind of the base scenario. Those days are essentially selected to try to minimize the error with the annual wind and solar profiles as well as the load. So we're trying to capture days that best essentially represent that window. And we model each of these days with 4-hour chunks. So rather than model every hour, we're simplifying the problem to kind of ensure the model stays computationally reasonable. Both the capacity credit and the stress periods kind of resource adequacy tests rely on 7 years of hourly data. So they expand upon what Reads is doing. By default, we're using 2007 and 2013 weather and load data, but I'll talk a bit about how we deviate from that for a sensitivity. Okay, so to understand how these two methods function, with different levels of solar, we basically design a set of scenarios that evaluate just that. So the rows of this table scenario matrix identify the different resource adequacy approaches. We have the capacity credit approach and the stress periods approach, which I just discussed. And then these different columns are depicting the different levels of solar deployment that we test. So we have what we're calling a business as usual case, which is sort of our moderate ATB cost trajectory. And basically all our best assumptions on existing policies and costs for technologies and things like that. And then we have a high solar case, and for that we essentially use the advanced cost case for solar and storage from the annual technology baseline. So this is assuming we get some cost improvements in both of those technologies, which leads to higher deployment of both of them. And you can see for the Southeast in 2050 in the BAU, we're a little over 30% of annual generation for solar in that BAU case, and then in the high PV we're up towards 45% of annual generation. So, both are quite a bit higher than today's, but the high PV case pushes further than the BAU. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the sensitivities that we looked at to evaluate the stress periods method. So one is regional coordination. I mentioned this a bit. This is, one proposed way to kind of have regions rely on each other during periods where they need to try to meet their resource adequacy targets. For that, we basically test zeroing out the hurdle rates, so allowing freer energy trade, and also enable firm capacity trade between the BAs, both in the capacity credit and the stress periods approach. Another kind of policy or maybe intervention that we test is a set of load reduction strategies. So for this, we kind of look at two different approaches, and an untargeted strategy that represents a 5% reduction in load in all hours, and then a targeted reduction, which is a 10% reduction in load, but only during the solar ramp hours, which are in the morning from 6 to 9, and in the evening, I think from 5 to 8-ish. Can double check on that later. So the idea is we kind of, we know as we add a bunch of solar that the periods of ramping are going to be, more difficult for the system to serve. And so we wanted to kind of explore whether having a more direct intervention in that period, provided additional benefits, or how that compared to kind of like a broader set of load reductions. So both of these are kind of interventions that we are, interested in seeing how the stress period method would handle these, and also just what we could learn about these as strategies for meeting resource adequacy target. We also ran some sensitivities that are maybe more geared at testing the robustness of the stress period method. So one of those was higher demand growth, where we just used a more accelerated demand pathway. This is from based on a high electrification pathway from evolved energy research, which ends up with a 2.7 continuous annual growth rate through 2050. So much higher levels of load, and also incorporating kind of changes to load shape, as people electrify space heating and vehicles and things like that. So we're interested in testing how the stress periods did with that load growth. And then another set was additional weather years. And this is, important, as I mentioned before, where you have different weather realizations posing new threats to your systems, and particularly pertinent for the Southeast, which faced Winter Storm Elliott, where you had a lot of outages and tight conditions. And this is where accounting for correlated generator outages with temperature can be really important. So this plot here is showing some simulated outages for the Southeast based on our data on correlated outages with temperature. And you can see, if you take 2012 and 2022, you have very different estimates of how much generation might be out during that December period. And so we're trying to basically capture, if we throw data related to a winter storm event at the model with the stress periods approach, are we able to still build a system that can kind of handle this type of event? So for this, we use a 2016 to 2022 hourly weather and load data for PRAS, and we use the 2022 data for selecting the representative days. And we also test this scenario with the higher demand levels to kind of see how those two would interact. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit first about the results from the reads to PRAS integration approach. So here I'm showing some results related to expected unserved energy from basically from PRAS, from that final test of the systems in 2050. And I'm showing a distribution. This is basically based on the PRAS simulation results. So we simulated 50 essentially draws of different outages, and then run PRAS and see how much unserved energy we get for the Southeast. So first, call your attention to the left plot, which is the business as usual case, BAU. And basically what we find is both the capacity credit and stress period approach, they build systems that are under the target. So we had this 10 parts per million target. That was sort of our resource adequacy reliability target that we wanted to meet. And based on our different assumptions and the heuristics, both these methods produce systems that essentially are reliable from the standpoint of that target. However, if you look at the high PV case, we can see that the capacity credit does not function as well. So basically in this system where we've added a lot more solar, when we test it with PRAS, after looking at the capacity credit build approach, we are exceeding that target. We're kind of above 20 parts per million, even though our target is 10. And then notably, when we fed this target and integrated the PRAS module with reads, we are able to essentially build a system that's kind of under the target. So we're getting a more reliable system with the stress period approach than we are with the capacity credit approach for this higher PV system. It's interesting to look a little bit about what the changes are to the challenges to the system. So in the high PV case, you basically see a much wider spread of time periods where you have potential for unserved energy. Left is showing the BAU, and you can see this is also splitting the unserved energy by hour, by season, which we bucketed into cold and hot. So in the BAU, you've got some risk in your evening in both the winter and the summertime, and a little bit of winter morning risk. In the high PV case, you've actually eliminated a lot of your summer evening risk, with a little bit of summer ramp risk in the early morning, but now you have a lot of risk of unserved energy at various points throughout the day in the cold season. So those are spiking in the morning and the evening ramps, but can kind of occur at any point throughout the day. So the stress period approach, it addresses some of that shortfall potential in unserved energy, and it does that by building kind of a different set of capacity. So it's interesting to here look at the kind of installed capacity that results from these systems. Left chart is showing the total installed capacity for the Southeast. The current-ish levels is showing 2023, shown all the way to the left, and then you can see 2020 or 2050 build outs for both BAU and high PV in those middle two panels. So regardless, in 2050, you're building a lot more new capacity as the system builds more solar, and as you have load growth and things like that. The high PV case does end up with more total capacity. You've got a lot more solar, which has a lower capacity factor annually, and so you've building more total capacity to meet the same amount of load, and you've got more of a mix of energy storage with some additional retirements of gas capacity. And then the right is showing the difference plot between the stress period and the capacity credit method. So essentially, you're able to see the differences between the two of these. In the BA, or I should say in both cases, you basically get the stress period approach building a somewhat diverse set of new resources to try to meet the shortfalls identified by PRAS. It is building a mix of wind, solar, and new kind of peaking combustion turbine plants with some retirements of gas combined cycle that would be more of like a, I don't know, continued sustained operations. I think the other notable piece here is that in the higher PV scenario, you see a big shift in energy storage duration. So you see 4-hour batteries essentially being swapped out for longer duration 8-hour devices to try to meet some of the perceived gaps. And in a couple slides, I'll show some examples that might be driving that type of behavior. And then another piece here is costs. So we can look at the total average wholesale electricity costs in 2050. This is in terms of dollars per megawatt hour. Again, just focused on the Southeast here. And the stress period approach does result in higher costs. You're building more capacity, and so you end up having higher costs of the system. And it's sort of reflecting, I guess, the trade-off between cost reliability, right? So you're getting higher reliability. You're not having as high risk of unserved energy or shortfall periods, but there's some additional cost that comes with that. And so this is part of the trade-off system planners have to make in terms of where they want to land on the cost reliability spectrum. Okay, so next I want to turn a little bit to what drives unserved energy in the capacity approach. So for this, we tried to really break down some of the potential ways that the approximation or heuristics in this kind of traditional capacity credit resource adequacy approach might fail to capture things, particularly for, again, systems with higher levels of solar. So first to highlight is that at higher PV levels, you're seeing a lot more risk periods that occur outside of your net peak load period. So at the start, I talked a little bit about the fact that capacity credit methods are typically focused on top net peak load or specific time periods of stress that often coincide with peak load or net load for assigning capacity credits. And so it'll system operators, or in the case of our method here, we take the top 20 net peak load hours and use that to evaluate the capacity credit for solar for new investments going forward. But what we're finding is reflected in these charts is you're getting a lot more risk periods that fall outside those periods. So the plot is showing the net load in orange and then the actual load in blue for the BAU and the high PV system. This is zooming into LGE, which is really covering Kentucky in our model. And then those red bars at the top are reflecting the time periods where you're getting potential shortfall or unserved energy. So you can see in the BAU, most of those risk periods are concentrated at times where you have high net peak load. Whereas in the high PV, you do have those risk periods when net peak load is high, but you're also seeing potential unserved energy in, a lot more times of the year, even when the net peak load is relatively low. So it suggests that, capacity credit methods, if they're just looking at peak net load hours, they're going to miss some of the potential for outage risks. And, to build on that, you can also have that occur when you're not looking at, kind of all the potential weather realizations, and those are occurring outside of net peak load as well. So this is reflecting the total net load. This is now for Duke Energy in one of the periods of unserved energy in the capacity credit method. And I've plotted the net load across different years. So we're looking at all kind of 7 years that get thrown into the PRAS analysis. 2012, which is the base year that's used for those representative days and reads, is shown in that dark black line. And then 2013 is shown in the red up top, and that is the year we have unserved energy, which occurs where those red ticks are to the right of the plot. So what we're finding is that, most years you have a lot of solar available during this day. This is a focus on January 25th, so it's a winter day. And your system is planning to essentially use that excess solar to charge up your storage and then use the storage to get through the evening peak. However, in some years, you basically have a lot less solar available in that day. And so you're not able to do that charging. And then, in the worst of those days, or worst of those years in 2013, you run into shortfall during the evening when you've essentially depleted your storage and you aren't able to kind of meet the ramp that occurs in the evening. So this is just one way, again, capacity credit doesn't necessarily pick this up because it's looking at the top net peak load hours. These these aren't necessarily top net peak load for the whole system, but because you've got a bunch of hours in the middle of the day where the solar wasn't really available, what was maybe a somewhat innocuous net peak period ends up being more of a challenge for the system. So directly capturing that kind of weather realization, which we can do with the stress period approach, helps because we're now able to kind of model what the conditions were during that day and plan accordingly. So another piece here is that the correlated outages, we can approximate those with things like average D rates in a capacity expansion model, but that misses the potential for having a kind of low risk, high impact outage event where you have essentially a bunch of things that go wrong at once. So the two bars I'm showing here are reflecting the available firm capacity. Now back in LGEE, we're looking at a December period where there was some unserved energy on the system, again, with the capacity credit approach. The left is showing what the firm capacity estimate is from reads. So the gray bar is kind of showing what's available based on the D rates. So we apply some D rates based on average forced outages to essentially say, well, you might not have all your capacity available. This is all non-VRE capacity. So we've essentially taken out things that are subject to weather availability. And so you can see what Reeds thinks is the surplus. This is the amount of capacity above that dashed line, which is the net load that needs to be, that's load after netting out wind and solar. So it's your non-VRE, basically all the load that needs to be met by your non-VRE capacity. So Reeds thinks it has a surplus, but when you go over to PRAS on the right, on average, you typically do. You most of the time have basically where that bar ends up, which is the kind of expected available capacity during this time period. But the error bar is reflecting kind of the full range of possible simulations. So you have some simulations where, because we're using this probabilistic model, we sample some cases where you just get some bad draws on the outage rates, and now you have a couple of generators out at one time. And because of that, the actual impact to available capacity is much greater. And in some of those scenarios, your total available capacity is falling below your net load, and now you end up with a deficit or a shortfall event. So this is, again, reflecting how this more kind of detailed probabilistic resource adequacy model can capture some of these kind of high impact, low probability type events. Okay, and then another piece that we kind of found was interesting is looking at the temporal resolution. So I mentioned earlier that there's with more wind and solar and storage resources, we're expecting to kind of have a better accounting for kind of chronological hourly operations. But having fine resolution can really matter here too, and it is particularly important for the capturing of the ramping of solar and net load. So here I'm showing an example for TVA. This is summer case in June. We have a shortfall event that occurs in the evening at 7 and 8 p.m. I'm showing the average and the max. This is basically based on the PRAS simulations, so you have some sampling there. So some cases are worse than others. And then the solid lines are showing what the actual load and net load are during that period, the actual hourly load, I should say. And the dashed lines are basically reflecting the 4-hour time chunk average that is going into reads. So because we're modeling reads at 4-hour time steps, we're taking averages for every 4 hours and putting that into the reads model. And you can basically see in that after noon period, you've got the net load ramping up very quickly as your solar resource goes off. But the time chunks is sort of not capturing the full extent of that increase. So if you look at kind of the second 2 time chunks, you're never getting up to the full net load peak that you see in the hourly model, because you're taking the average of that period where the net load is increasing. And so Reeds is essentially seeing a lower kind of net load requirement in that time window than you're actually experiencing when you throw it into the hourly resolution of PRAS. So this is, just to reflect that kind of things like these temporal assumptions can make a difference when you're evaluating your system. And it's, one reason why, again, with more solar and storage, there's kind of a need for more granular temporal resolution, and considering hourly chronological modeling. Okay, so the last set of things I want to touch here, just some of the sensitivities we ran on the kind of stress testing approach. Again, to recap, we kind of did two different sets. We did some that were kind of testing robustness, where we looked at different weather years and also different load growth scenarios. And then we looked at some that were kind of testing different interventions. This is considering things like regional coordination and also different load reduction strategies. And what we find is that our stress period method essentially can take all of those scenarios and build systems that are meeting our reliability target. X-axis here is just showing that range of sensitivities. The Y is showing the total unserved energy. These box plots are reflecting the distribution of unserved energy across all 50 samples from that final PRAS analysis that's done in 2050. And in both the BAU and the PV cases, our stress period method is producing systems that are kind of well below our 10 ppm reliability target. So it's handling things like the alternate weather years, or even the alternate weather years with higher demand, although you can see those have higher unserved energy than some of the other scenarios. Again, they're kind of built to the system's target that we're specifying. Maybe worth noting here, we'll come back to this a bit, but the regional coordination scenario in particular is like really able to drop the the unserved energy that's experienced by the system. So suggests that has a potentially big role to play in resource adequacy here. Like before, you get different capacity buildouts for these with the stress period approach for these systems. So this is just showing the range of buildouts across that full set. Most of it is, I think, somewhat intuitive. Like the regional coordination, you end up having to build less total capacity because you're able to share and coordinate more across the regions. Higher demand builds more total capacity. This is same thing, but now just reflecting the difference from the base, which maybe highlights some of those points I was making on the previous slide. I think another interesting point to note too is you see a lot of these sensitivities result in less requirement for 8-hour storage in the high BV scenario. So things like regional coordination and the two load reduction scenarios seem to be effective at maybe reducing your total requirement for that longer duration energy storage, which can be maybe difficult to obtain and build for the system. And then we have a range of costs here. Some of these are maybe a little bit harder to compare because you have higher demand in some cases, and so you might have higher costs for the total system, but you're spreading it out over more megawatt hours. But basically, this is to kind of reflect that, again, the stress period approach can handle these types of scenarios, and it provides one way to kind of evaluate the cost effectiveness of some of these interventions. So here we find that again, things like regional coordination and the two load reduction strategies both able to provide some cost savings relative to the kind of base scenario. And then, a last point I want to close on here is, regional coordination can reduce costs and improve reliability, but does, require new transmission. So this plot is showing the total new transmission capacity built across the Southeast over time. I've separated into kind of within BA transmission, inter-BA, so that's within the BAs in the Southeast, but still within the Southeast, and then interregional, which would be connecting to neighbors in MISO and PJM. And so you see, when you allow regional coordination, you can get a lot more transmission built, particularly interregional coordination. There's a big, the model is really takes a liking to that. And some of that is because, you get system like the Southeast, which has a lot of strong solar resource, and it's right next to MISO, which has a lot of strong wind resource, and so there's a lot of opportunity for those regions to kind of build transmission and help balance each other out. I think another important point I want to make here is that these benefits are really captured best by the stress period method. So you'll notice that the transmission build-outs reported in this plot I have for both the capacity credit method and the stress period method. The capacity credits shown in the dark or the solid lines and the stress period in the dashed lines. And you really only see the bulk of that transmission being built when the stress periods method is being used. And I think that is reflecting something, again, maybe a limitation of the capacity credit approach. If you're just using a region's net peak period to understand capacity credits for resources in that region, it's much more difficult to kind of translate that to like, well, how is that resource going to be available to share with other regions? And how can I interact with others to kind of ensure resource adequacy during times of stress at a regional or interregional level? And so, this is another way where this kind of stress period approach can, I think, help capture some of those interregional benefits in a way that capacity credits don't seem to be able to do as well. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna start close out here. So, again, although it performs well in today's system, the capacity credit approximation method may face challenges modeling systems with higher levels of solar and storage. So even though it's been, I think, a good method, and planners have been using it for a long time, it seems likely to face more challenges as you think about systems with higher levels of solar and storage. And so this work is kind of presenting a different approach that integrates planning and resource adequacy models, and that seems to potentially address some of these shortfalls, which would help planners deliver more reliable systems. Here we find this integrated approach addresses shortfall risk that's identified in the resource adequacy model by adding a diverse mix of new capacity, and in the case of the high BEV scenario, more long duration storage to try to manage some of those instances where you are having potential shortfall. That higher reliability is achieved, but with some increase in costs. So we found 3 to 4% increase in 2050 average system costs. And another thing to note, I didn't talk about this previously, but it imposes more computational burden when running these scenarios, and is a kind of more complex. It requires an additional resource adequacy tool and integrating those. So there are kind of trade-offs to consider there in terms of modeling capability and things like that. And then lastly, our integrated approach seems to handle a range of sensitivities pretty well. It's robust to some of the things we threw at it, including the alternate weather years and the higher level demand. And it's able to capture the benefits of interventions, and particularly for the regional coordination case, it captures resource diversity and available generation and capacity in a way that's really not done well by the capacity credit approach. Okay, so with that, I want to close out for some questions. I haven't been checking the Q&A, but we can visit some of those. I would also like to take a moment to thank our DOE sponsor, Amar, who's been great, and we've really enjoyed working on this. And so yeah, really thank everyone for attending and for your time, and looking forward to take any questions.
Hey, Brian, I had one thought or question, maybe to kick things off here a little bit, but in the stress period approach, you get down to reliability ratings well below the 10 ppm target. So I was just wondering if then you have this 3 to 4% cost increase at the end, but maybe some of that's sort of getting even higher reliability than the target is needed for the target. And so perhaps there's a even lower cost approach that still meets the reliability target.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So uh, this iterative approach, like you could imagine iterating until you get exactly to the target. We basically the way we set it up was to once you've achieved below the target to stop, and that was kind of to reduce the number of iterations and keep things reasonable for runtime purposes. But you're exactly right. Like if you could imagine building a system and then trying to relax that a little bit until you get kind of right onto your targets. Um, and that would suggest building less total capacity, and then that cost increase might not be so high. So that is something we've actually been exploring with this method is sort of how to um, I don't know, more fine tune and hit the target more precisely, in a way that also doesn't kind of make it iterate uh, many numbers of times and kind of really blow up the runtime. So that's something we're looking at for ongoing work.
Well, I could ask another question. On slide 26, it's really interesting to see the interregional transmission shoot up really with the stress period approach. Um, yeah. And I was wondering if, like, sort of what is the optimization process there? I guess I sort of lose track a little bit between the different approaches. Is that mainly driven by the need to meet these reliability events, or is it also partly an economic decision there?
I think it's both. I think, yeah, unpacking how much is one versus the other is maybe a little tricky, but would be like a valuable thing to try to understand a bit more. Um, one of the things when we took this approach, I think one of the drivers here is when we introduce a stress period, we're targeting a period that PRAS identifies as having shortfall or unserved energy in a particular region. So we might identify the Southeast has like a shortfall risk at a certain day in February. But we model that day throughout, the whole model. So we're introducing that everywhere. So we're capturing that in all the surrounding regions as well. And so I do think, now, so we're basically able to see, okay, that was a stressful day in the Southeast, but there's a lot of extra wind in MISO next door. And so if you want to to trade energy to kind of meet that demand, uh, you could do that. And so I think, the fact that a lot of it's driven by the stress period approach, like you have so much of it only when the stress period's on, um, suggests to me that it's really driven by resource adequacy, since you could trade energy in the capacity credit method just fine, um, and it builds new transmission, but not nearly as much. I think that suggests it's a lot of that is resource adequacy value, but we'd probably have to try to parse that out a little bit more carefully if we want to understand the kind of mix of benefits for that kind of for those transmission investments. I haven't actually checked the Q&A. There wasn't anything in there, is there?
There were two questions that Fritz
Oh,
answered during the.
okay.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to jump in with questions? Feel free. Well, I'm happy to stick around if folks want to follow up. Otherwise we could close it out here. We I think we sent out the slides already, but folks should feel free to reach out if they have questions, or are interested in kind of other follow-ups on this work. I put my email here. Can also connect folks to the rest of the team as well. Again, big shout out to DOE for funding this work. We really appreciate the support. And yeah, I want to thank all the collaborators at NREL, LBL, and Fritz. You guys have all been great to work with. So we are hoping to, kind of synthesize this work and publish it in a journal article. So that's the kind of last piece for us going forward, and happy to let folks know when that's available if that's of interest.
Thanks, Brian.